Welcome to Inner Immigrate. I am Anna Keating. Today's guest is the journalist and Pulitzer Prize winning biographer Jonathan Eig. He's here to talk about his biography, King: A Life. Every single American should read this book. I'm showing it to you because it is that good. You think you know the story of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, but I promise you, you do not. There is so much more you will learn from this book and hopefully from this conversation. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Inner Immigrate.
Thanks, Anna. It's great to talk to you.
Before we get into King, your book, I wanted to ask you how you grew up and if you always knew that you wanted to be a writer.
I don't know about always, but pretty early. I grew up in New York, in the suburbs of New York City. I was born in Brooklyn and grew up in Rockland County, New York, and didn't know any writers. Didn't ever think about being a writer. It was a very sort of working middle class neighborhood, but it was also the age of like celebrity journalists when Woodward and Bernstein were bringing down presidents, and I think it became very cool to think about journalism. And that's what really got me interested in the writing business. I went to work for my junior high school newspaper, and then my high school newspaper, and my hometown newspaper. When I was 16, I started working in the sports department at the Rockland County Journal News, and just fell in love with the idea of taking my little notebook. I think I have a reporter's notebook somewhere, and going out and interviewing people. That really helped me overcome my shyness. And writing seemed like a nice way of expressing myself, especially because I was shy. It gave me time to think about what I wanted to say. And I very quickly just discovered that I really liked the writing part of school a lot better than the math and science part of school. So I set out to become a newspaper reporter. And that's what I did for a long time, and eventually made my way into books, but that's a long story.
Okay. You have written books about amazing Americans, Jackie Robinson, Al Capone, Muhammad Ali, this incredible book about MLK. Do you feel that your own background matters as an author? You say you grew up in a Jewish middle-class neighborhood in New York. How does your own background matter or not matter as a biographer?
Well, I think it would be naive to pretend that our backgrounds don't matter and don't affect the way we think. I grew up in a middle class suburb of New York, Jewish, not terribly religious as a kid, but I also grew up attending integrated schools in part because of the work of the Civil Rights Movement, and had this observation very early on that I had Black friends at school, but not in my neighborhood. Then I went to college and found that there was an African American Studies department, also the product of the Civil Rights Movement. Students at Northwestern University protested after King's death that they wanted more classes and more professors dedicated to studying Black history. So all of these things affected the course of my life. But I think that my background, my religion, absolutely shapes my views. At the same time, the role of the journalist and the historian is to be as objective as possible, not pretending that we don't have our own biases that we bring to any story we tell, but that I'm going to try to tell my stories and be as invisible as possible, and not make myself try not to bend the arc of the story according to my own wishes or desires or political views.
Yeah, I love the book, and I did feel that you kind of disappeared onto the page because the voices of the people some of whom you actually spoke to, come through so clearly in the story. Why did you decide now was the time to write a new biography on King?
Well, that's really like this moment of epiphany that I had. I was working on a book about Muhammad Ali. That was my previous book, and I thought for sure it was going to be the most difficult and ambitious and exciting book of my life, and it really was in every way, completely satisfying and challenging and thrilling, and the honor of to be Muhammad Ali's biographer, unauthorized. That I take this on without the family's permission, but nevertheless to take that life in my hands was just this huge thrill. And then along the way in working on that book, I found myself meeting people who knew not only Ali but knew King, and some of them were very close friends with King, like Jesse Jackson and Dick Gregory and Harry Belafonte and Andrew Young. And as I began talking to them about King and Ali and how they got along, it occurred to me that there were still hundreds of people alive who knew Martin Luther King Jr., and this might be the last chance to write a biography with the cooperation of his friends and family and colleagues. And that's when I looked and saw that the last King biography was almost 35, 40 years old at that point. I'm not including the David Garrow book and Taylor Branch books as biographies. Those are something different. They were 20 years old too. So it had been a long time since anyone had written a biography of King. And perhaps more importantly, in that time since those books were written, we've seen King lost really in many ways as a person. We've seen him turn to Mr. I Have a Dream. And we've forgotten that he was a human being, flesh and blood, with flaws and fears and failures, and that there was still an opportunity. And I think in doing that, we render him kind of less effective, less meaningful in our lives, because we water down his message. We make him safe. And that's something, Harry Belafonte, and these guys urged me to write this book. I don't know if I would have had the guts to do it otherwise. But Belafonte and Jesse Jackson, they all felt like we needed a new King biography because the national holiday and the celebration had rendered him unrecognizable to these guys. They said he was a radical. You've forgotten even how religious he was. We've lost sight as a society of what he was really like. And a new biography, I thought, might help push back against that.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Your book shows how radical his views were, how deep his faith was, and as you said, how complicated he was as a person. And some people, I grew up in the conservative American West, use some of his flaws against him, as we will go into later in the conversation. But your book actually made him seem like a real human being, and his achievements were that much more impressive, given that he was a flawed, complicated person like all of us. So I want to thank you for putting all of those different pieces together in this remarkable book. I think it gives us hope as people who want to make the world a better place and are ourselves also flawed individuals and complicated people, like King was. If you would permit me, Jonathan, I would love to start with King's assassination and then work backwards to his childhood. Because it's talked about a lot in the news, even today, of who killed Martin Luther King Jr.
Is that your question? Who killed him?
Yeah. I mean, well, because you talk about the man who assassinated him, but it's still an open question if there were also other people who are held responsible for how King died at such a young age.
Well, the short answer is that we killed him. Racist white America killed him. I believe James Earl Ray probably pulled the trigger. There's a lot of people who don't think so, including King's family members, including some of the people I mentioned before. Belafonte and Andrew Young really believe there was some kind of a very complicated conspiracy by the American government. It's never been proven, and new documents have been released. The Trump administration has released a lot of new material, and none of it has provided any further evidence to support the conspiracy theories. And maybe it's unfair to call them conspiracy theories. They're, I think it's an accurate description, but I haven't seen anything to compel me to think that we should revisit the traditional explanation, which is that James Earl Ray pulled the trigger. But I think the more important thing to remember is that our government intentionally created the conditions that would make someone like James Earl Ray want to assassinate King. The FBI explicitly stated that their goal was to destroy his reputation, to damage his standing. They even planned for a replacement, someone they wanted to see take over as the leader of the civil rights movement. There was a memo written just months before King's assassination by the FBI saying that now that Malcolm X was dead, King was the only one left who could become the Black Messiah, and we must do everything in our powers to stop that from happening. So there's plenty of reason to believe that the government had it in for him. There's plenty of reason to believe they created the conditions that would inspire someone to want to assassinate him. But there has not yet been, clear proof that it was actually orchestrated by the government. But there are a lot of peculiarities about the assassination, and the fact that James Earl Ray got away with it, that he was able to escape and for so long, that he was able to flee the country, that he had multiple passports. All that is strange for a guy who was basically a drifter.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that. That racist America created the conditions that killed Martin Luther King Jr. And the government also helped play a role in creating those conditions of hating and fearing him as the Black Messiah. Let's go back to his childhood and how he grew up. He was only 2 generations removed from slavery. How did King's family shape who he became, his origin story?
It's such an important subject, and I'm glad you asked about it. And we often are, biographers are criticized for focusing too much on one man, the one man theory of history. And it's often man. It's a sexist genre.
Yeah.
So I think it was really important in this book to explore King's family, including his wife, Coretta, who was essential to everything King did, and not just as a supporting player, but as an activist in her own right. His mother, his grandmother, and in fact, I begin my book with the story of King's grandmother. And she was a sharecropper. She was born into slavery, and King's, as you mentioned, King was just 2 generations removed from slavery. We go from slavery to sharecropping, the next generation, to Nobel Peace Prize winner. I mean, it's only in America, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King. These are 2 titanic figures that could only have come from America. Nowhere else do we see people rise from such humble origins to such incredible heights and such achievement. And the story is not just Martin Luther King's. It's his parents, his grandparents, his father, Martin Luther King Sr., is a subject, a man worthy of operas. We should be writing operas about, and biographies just about Daddy King, as we called him. This is a kid who at 13 walks off the farm, tired of sharecropping, sees what it's done to his father, and decides he's not going to have it. He's basically illiterate. He walks and hops a train to Atlanta and reinvents himself, marries into the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where he sees opportunity, talks his way into Morehouse College, and raises this child who will change the world. These are extraordinary people. And, we often see the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King in this bubble. Like, the 1960s came and Black people discovered that they could fight for their justice and equality. But no, their fathers and their mothers and their grandmothers and their grandfathers were fighting for it generations earlier. They just weren't breaking through, but they were creating the path that would enable Martin Luther King and the other activists of the 60s to break through.
Yes, thank you for saying that. I really loved that your book did not hide the supporting players, including the women whose work is so often invisible. And you really talk about his mother. You talk about Coretta, who we'll get more into later, and his father, and all these key players that make him a person who believed that the kind of life he lived, where he won a Nobel Peace Prize, was possible. That's incredible. It's just an incredible story. It's a page turner. I couldn't put it down. This is not a dad book. You will not be able to stop reading it. If you are not a dad, read it too. I was active in the Catholic peace work movement in college. So our heroes were like Dorothy Day, Daniel Berrigan, and of course, MLK. How did King discover nonviolence? Was it just a strategy? Or was it also something that he truly believed in, a way of life for him?
Well, that's a great question. And the answer is yes. It's all of those things. It grows from his belief in God and the teachings of Jesus, which is, of course, rooted in nonviolence. And then he explores it academically, beginning at Morehouse, where he's reading Nietzsche and Rauschenbusch and Howard Thurman and studying Gandhi. And he's absorbing all these ideas. And he goes to Crozier Seminary in Pennsylvania, his first time out of the South, living out of the South for more than a little bit, and hears people speaking about Gandhi, meets people who have met Gandhi, and becomes more engaged with this and begins to apply it to his religious teachings. But at this point, it's still just concept. It's not really until the Montgomery bus boycott begins that he begins to think about how this can become a strategy, a tactic. And in fact, it seems a little bit superficial at times when he begins. he's sort of thrust into this role as the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott. He's not looking for this job. He's not looking to become an activist, a full-time protest leader, but he's thrust into this job and immediately realizes the danger. In fact, his home is bombed. He's getting death threats almost every night, and he goes out and buys a gun. And when Bayard Rustin comes to Montgomery to advise and to offer strategic advice, he says to King, I've noticed that you've been talking a lot about nonviolent protest and that the way to stand up to the injustice in Montgomery is by protesting peacefully. But what's with the gun? How can you claim to be nonviolent and a believer in Gandhian tactics if you've got a gun under the sofa cushion? And you start to see King evolving. It goes from being a strategy to being a way of life and a philosophy and a guiding principle. Certainly by the mid-'60s, when he's protesting the Vietnam War, he has fully embraced nonviolence. So it's an evolution, and that's just another sign of his humanity, that he's not, dropped, he's not formed fully as this iconic figure. He's figuring it out as he goes along.
Absolutely. I think it's really incredible. One of the things your book does is capture, the power of books. You really trace all of the books that he read that formed him and his movement, but also the incredible violence of that time. I mean, it's really like the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I think that it gets whitewashed for us in school. You mentioned that his home was bombed. He's stabbed. He's punched in the face. Not just King, but so many members of the movement experienced such extreme violence and yet embraced nonviolence. And so really sitting with that with your book as such a really radical position, where it's not just I have a dream speech, it's really an incredibly brave thing. And I wonder how he was able to not carry a gun truly, or to live and accomplish so much under such incredible terrorism, truly. I mean, if your house is bombed, how was he able to live and endure and do great things while under that kind of fear?
I think that's an incredibly important observation, and it applies not just to King, but to Black people throughout America, certainly throughout the South, and to some extent, to a regrettable extent, even today. What kept Black people from protesting Jim Crow laws in the 1950s and 60s? What kept them from refusing to ride in the back of the bus? Well, it was mostly fear. Yes, the law was there, but it was the fear of what would happen if they spoke out. The Klan and the White Citizens Council was very real. The presence was unavoidable. The Klan, when King was a kid, marched down his street in the blackest, richest neighborhood in all of Atlanta. The Klan had the courage to march down the street on Auburn Avenue. And when the Civil Rights Movement began and when the Montgomery bus boycott began in 1955, Klan membership doubled overnight. The mayor and the police chief joined the White Citizens Council. So what was keeping people in check? It was fear. And King's great gift was his ability to help people overcome that fear. Which matters more to you, your values, your religious beliefs, or your fear? Which one are you going to let guide your life? It's something all of us wrestle with. What are we willing to stand up for? Can we summon the courage to put our values ahead of our fears? And that's what King did. And we see it happening in real time. We see people speaking back to their white employers in Montgomery saying, don't you dare tell me what to do anymore. I am not going to ride that bus. I am going to walk to work. And if I'm late, deal with it. If you want to fire me, deal with it. We are not going to be afraid anymore. And I think King's ability to do that is clearly rooted in his religion. He believes that there's something bigger than himself. He's willing to die for this movement because he believes this is what God commands us to do and how to behave.
Yeah, it seems that you are suggesting in your book that a lot of his courage came from his belief that he had a calling from God to lead people to freedom.
Yeah,
and I want to say, one of the things that strikes me is that this history seems both very far away and very recent, because my own ancestors believed that the Montgomery, the civil rights movement, people coming in to integrate, were troublemakers. This is not that long ago. King would have been in his 90s today. My white ancestors believed that they didn't understand how things were done in the South, and they were outsiders. And so it's really important to realize that this very, very intense movement for civil rights is very recent history and continues in many ways in our own time. One of the things that's very interesting to me in your book is how King appealed to both Black and white Americans, given that they had been taught to hate and fear one another. How was he able to do that, to build a movement that included Jews and Catholics and white Protestant Christians, as well as, of course, Black Americans?
One of the things that really mattered, first of all, the fact that he's a minister helps. It gives him a level of credibility and respect. And he's a doctor. He studied at Boston University and earned this degree. So he gets a little bit of respect for that. That wouldn't have been enough because obviously there's still a lot of racism. And but the key really is that he's building his cause. He's building his appeal. His whole movement is really built on hope, on positivity, on the Bible and the Constitution. Like, how are you going to argue with the Bible and the Constitution? He's making it hard for people like your ancestors and my ancestors to say, well, he's just a troublemaker. No, he's quoting the Bible and the Constitution in everything he does. He's saying if we're wrong in demanding justice, then the Bible is wrong and God is wrong and the Constitution is wrong and the Supreme Court is wrong. So we can't be wrong, right? And it's forcing people, even people who are strongly inclined to prejudice, to racism, to think, scratch their heads a little bit and say, wait a second, the Bible does say we're all made in God's image. How do I balance that with the idea that the Bible, for me, that some people think the Bible justifies slavery? All right, I've got to start wrestling with this now. And what King is saying is that we're not here to tear down the American system. We're here to enhance it. We're here to make those words of the Constitution come true, that all men are created equal. So help us do this, and we can be a better country. And it really seems to be, opening a lot of hearts and minds, at least for a while.
Yes, he's saying we don't want to overthrow America, we want to join it. And
Right, and
that
make it
is a
better.
very positive message, and it resonated with many people. One of the things that's just always struck me as someone who wanted to write books is what an incredible writer and orator King was, and how he gave, as you just said, those texts back to people and said, we want to join together in this great dream. Lots of whites were upset or were happy in the North when King wanted to desegregate the South, because they didn't think there was racism in the North. They thought that was a Southern problem. But then in your book, when he comes to the North, he loses a lot of popularity with his white supporters. Why is that?
Well, you kind of nailed it. When you're protesting segregation in Birmingham and Selma and St. Augustine, Florida, and calling on whites to come down and join you and to send money, it's easy, right? Like, oh, those terrible Southerners, that mean old Bull Connor. Here you go, Dr. King. I'll send a check, and I'll even come down and march with you across that bridge. And then but all along, King was saying, even when he was coming to Chicago and New York and Philadelphia and raising money, he would say, by the way, you got problems here too, and we're going to talk about it. I'm coming back to talk about the fact that your schools and your neighborhoods are segregated. And at the same time, these white people, including, perhaps members of my family, were sending small donations to the SCLC. They were moving out of the city to the suburbs because they saw the growth of minority populations. They saw the shifts in demographics. So there was a problem in the North, and the Northern media didn't want to write about it either. So it's really easy for the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times to send a reporter down to tell this great story about this brilliant Southern preacher who's challenging the system of Jim Crow segregation. But when you come up north and you start talking about challenging the segregated schools in Chicago, suddenly the Chicago Tribune thinks you're out of your league. Stay in your lane, shut up and dribble, whatever cliche you want to go with. When King attempted to lead protest movements in the North, he never got the same traction, in part because he didn't have the same support from the white media or from the white community in general.
Right. He truly was a prophet in that he wasn't just asking some people to change. He was asking everybody to look at injustice in their community. And that's a really unpopular thing to ask people to do. You really go into in your book how deeply unequal the schooling was. And you say, I think it becomes clear that King came into college with almost the equivalent of a sixth grade education because the Black schools were so inferior to the white schools. And so asking for justice in things like education was upsetting a kind of privilege that white people took for granted, that their schools, their parks, everything that they had was better, and that they didn't want to share. And so I really thank you for kind of going into that issue that was also in the North. It wasn't just in one part of America, it was all the way through our whole country, although in different iterations. Your book was so compulsively readable. It's like a film. You see the pressure that King was under in the North, in the South, obviously from white racists and segregationists, but also from Black critics who felt that his approach was wrong. He was also under pressure, which we discussed before, from the US government and from J. Edgar Hoover, who, as you mentioned, was tapping not just his phones, but the phones of his friends. Why did Hoover target King? I am so shocked by this plot line, and I really would love you to speak to it a little bit.
It's really one of the most depressing parts of this story. It's one of the most depressing chapters in American history, that this man who gave his life, risked his life to try to unite this country became public enemy number one almost. And this country that today celebrates it with a national holiday actively set out to destroy him. Why? Why after the March on Washington, for example, when King gives this soaring speech and the nation really seems to feel like we could be coming together. Even the white mainstream media says this could be the turning point. We may finally be able to shed the legacy of slavery. We may be able to become one country, finally. Why, after that, does the FBI increase its surveillance and increase its campaign to destroy Dr. King? Well, the answer is pretty simple, really. It's racism. It's that they are afraid of change. They're afraid that the status quo might have to shift. It's been so good to white Americans for so long. And why would we want to give up this power that we've got? I think that's what it boils down to. And it's heartbreaking because King is trying to summon the best of what we can be. As you said, he's a prophet, and prophets often challenge us in ways that make us uncomfortable. They challenge God even in ways that make our stories complicated. And King is really incapable of playing these political games, and perhaps naive in seeing the impact that his words are having on the FBI and the power structure in America. And he is the victim as a result of that. And the FBI begins its surveillance of King because they're afraid he might be a communist. They quickly see that he's not a communist. But by the time they've concluded that, they've got him on tape with women, and they know that's something they can use against him. And that really becomes the key to the surveillance. And that's why LBJ, who's counting on King to help pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, is at the same time urging the FBI to release King's hotel room tapes to the media. So King is just really in an impossible position as a result of this.
It is so tragic and so ironic, I guess, because as you said, he was working with President Johnson to pass incredible legislation, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and yet President Johnson was allowing him to be basically terrorized and also intimidated by the FBI at the same time. So King is coming to Johnson in good faith, wanting to work together, but this sort of other thing is happening behind the scenes of him being surveilled and the revelations that he had affairs with women being used to intimidate him and try to silence him. It's very tragic. It's also very ironic because you don't go into this much in the book, but Johnson himself had affairs. I mean, it was a very common thing then and now. And so why was King singled out in this way? I want to say that even though there is a lot of heavy stuff in your book, it is ultimately very hopeful because you show that a man who's, as you said, grandparents were in slavery, father grew up as a sharecropper, could win the Nobel Peace Prize. You show that in Birmingham, Alabama, a bastion of the KKK, where there had been 360 lynchings since Reconstruction, that you could get integration happening. So King did achieve incredible things despite a lifetime of pushing against what felt like a brick wall, including from certain people who wrongly labeled him a communist, etc. The problems that King talked about were militarism, materialism, and racism. Do you see those things reemerging today in our society? Did they ever really go away? That's kind of a big question.
Yeah. Sadly, King was a prophet in that way. He warned over and over again about the dangers of materialism and militarism, as well as racism. He saw these things as three equal evils that threaten to bring down our society, and we're still seeing plenty of all of those things: racism, the materialism, the incredible growth in income inequality, the massive spending on war. And King said these things didn't just damage us economically; they rotted our souls. He wasn't a politician; he was a preacher, and he said that his job was to save souls and to save not just American souls, but the world's souls, and that materialism and militarism and racism all rotted our souls. And when we think about the vast amounts of money that we spend, on war that could be spent on education, right? He was very practical about these things, and I think he warned us that we were headed for destruction, chaos or community. His last book was called "Where Do We Go From Here?" Chaos or community, and he saw hope that we could choose community, but there are a lot of signs that chaos has grown far more than community has in the time since he wrote that.
Yeah, it's interesting because you didn't grow up religious, but it took you 6 years to write this book, and you understand his theology and his spiritual worldview so profoundly. As a person of faith, I really appreciated that. And you go into the insight of the spiritual insight. You say he's not a politician, that segregation, for example, harms both the segregationist and the segregated. So he really had this gift of helping people see the spiritual dimension of the injustices in our society. And I think that sometimes breaks through the noise of politics to really pierce our hearts. And these ongoing issues that we face of militarism, racism, and materialism that harm us. It harms us if someone is going hungry, and both the person going hungry and the person who is standing by and doing nothing is harmed in that injustice. So it's a really powerful book. I think in many ways it's a blueprint for our moment, not only to know that nonviolent resistance can work, but also how to rebuild an America that is very divided, because at some point we will need to rebuild and become, as you said, one America. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on what King would say to us now on how to do that, because there will be a time, for example, when Trump is no longer in office, and how do we become the United States of America and work together to build a table of brotherhood, as King would say? I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I wouldn't dare to attempt to inspire with King's rhetoric or his beautiful eloquence, but I will say that I had the opportunity to ask people like John Lewis and Harry Belafonte and Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young these questions. What would King say today? And they reminded me that times were a lot worse, and times were a lot harder, and what King suffered is beyond our comprehension today. So we've seen a lot of progress since King's time on earth, his too brief time on earth, his 39 years, and his too brief 13-year career as a leader and a moral and spiritual leader. We've seen a lot of progress since that time. Let's not forget that. Let's not forget how much inspiration and how much hope we've gained in that time. And let's also not ignore the problems that are out there today. And let's continue to believe, as King, if King could believe after 29 times of being imprisoned and having been stabbed in the chest and having his home bombed and shot at, if he could continue to believe that there was still cause for hope, then we can too, and we can continue to do the work to build those communities, because that's the key. Is that King built communities, he built hope, he connected people, and we are so divided today for so many reasons. And I think what King would say, and what John Lewis and all those others said, is that we have to find ways to feel connected again and to love one another.
That's so very well said. And I also love that you say, I think every generation thinks they're living through the hardest or the worst. And you're saying it was a lot worse. And I think reading this book in a weird way is hopeful. A, that someone could continue to have hope in the conditions in which King lived, and that it has been really bad before and that we have gotten through it. That can be a kind of medicine for the reader, because it was really, 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 really bad. And your third grade, history teacher tried to tell you about it, but you were in the third grade. You need to read this book. You need to get more information and really inform yourself, because there's a lot that she might have skipped over because she didn't think you were ready for it, and you're ready for it now. It's an incredible book. I hope everybody reads it. I also want to plug your Spotify playlist that you made to accompany the book. It's called King, a Playlist. That was so wonderful. Why did you decide to do that?
I don't know. It's just fun,
It's
as
really
you're writing
fun.
these books, you come across songs that he referenced, or that his friends said that they listened to together, and I just started, adding them to a list. And then it's not meant to be something you necessarily listen to while you're reading the book. I just, and you're also like, I'm always trying to think, like, how am I going to reach more readers? Anything I can do to add 2 or 3 more readers. So if a playlist helps, then that's great too. But it's mostly just fun for me.
Yeah, it's really
I
fun.
have
I've
one
been
for
listening.
I have one for Muhammad Ali too. I have
I
an
love it.
Ali
I
playlist
love
as
it.
well.
It's fun, and it shows how everybody plays a part, even the artists, even the musicians. I mean, you talk about people, even white actors who would play a part, Steve McQueen, everyone can play a little part in creating this brotherhood and moving rights forward, for Black Americans. So that's really fun too. I really recommend the book. I really recommend the playlist. Jonathan, thank you so much for writing it and for all that you do.
Well, thank you. It's great talking to you.
Everybody, read it. And thank you for listening. Thanks.